Hi everyone, my name is Scarlett Ruwe. I'm a sophomore from Idaho Falls. I'm majoring in broadcast journalism and political science. I think a lot about what it means to report with integrity. I think about access, representation, and the responsibility that comes with having a platform. One thing I really appreciate about David's work is that it doesn't just inform, but it also asks the hard questions. It's my honor to introduce David Folkenflik. David is an award-winning media correspondent for NPR where he covers journalism, politics, and the media industry itself.
Thank you for that really kind and lovely and insightful introduction, I think. Aside from the parts about me, I thought there was a lot of truth being spoken there. First off, I do want to thank folks for making this possible, for Provost Lawrence, for Professor Cecilic Miskimen, and particularly for my at once new and old friend Kenton Bird for prevailing upon me all these years. He and I spoke first and tried to speak literally, essentially, as COVID was breaking out in 2020. We did arrange to speak virtually, and that was fun. This is better, and I'm glad I was able to fulfill a pledge I made to myself back then to make it happen. So thank you for persevering, Kenton, on that. I have with me just a little book that I just wrote a few notes on. I don't have a prepared text that's been reviewed, but this reminds me about something I talked about with students today, which is that I find a reporter's notebook, and in the first part of my career as a print reporter, and then as the little handheld recording devices we've used in the years since I've been a broadcaster, as a passport to a broader world, whether on a college campus or the world writ large. And it really has enabled me to go places I would not be able to go and ask people questions I would not be able to expect answers to. And the reporter's life has been just a wonderful, embracing thing to do. So thank you for that. With that in mind, I wanted to welcome folks here, to thank the Oppenheimer brothers for making this possible and for believing in the importance not of just thinking about the media, but thinking about first principles of the media. My first assignment in covering the media, I'd covered higher education for some years. I had covered Congress. I thought that was a lofty thing. And then I was assigned and asked to cover media, and it wasn't really clear initially. They thought I'd cover maybe local cable TV companies. And I thought, well, maybe we can think a little bit more ambitiously here. First assignment I got was to cover a little CBS show called Big Brother. Some of you may have heard of it. It's still around today. And, you know, the idea was that people would live in a house together and they would be taped and they could be recorded the entire length of their interactions, and you'd see the interplay, the human friction, the relationships that built up and fell apart, and how people behave in close quarters. It didn't remind me of anything so much as something I'd learned about in college that had been conceived by the 18th century political philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And he had come up with this thing many of you may know about, but it was called the panopticon. What was the panopticon? The panopticon was the idea of a reformist prison where there would be cells arrayed in such a way that the warden could sit at the center but unobserved, and at any place he could see inside any cell because of the architecture of it. There were no cameras in the 1800s or 1700s, I should say, but that because of the architecture of it, you could see in any prison cell anywhere around it, and therefore any prisoner who was misbehaving could expect retribution and punishment because you couldn't be out of the sight of anyone. This was seen, Jeremy Bentham thought this would encourage better behavior. This had the prospect to drive prisoners crazy because they didn't know when they were being observed and when they weren't, when they were being surveilled and when they weren't. And the idea of observation became the idea of surveillance. And the idea of surveillance over time is an idea of distraction. People being driven to distraction as their prisoners, or maybe the people watching them using it for their own entertainment. Journalism is about a different kind of watching. It's really more about bearing witness, I think. It's about the idea of being present. It's about the idea of reflecting the broader world and your own intimate community in a way that can both teach people and a way they can also relate to, they can recognize themselves in. One of the things I'm proud about for NPR and public broadcasting is the degree to which we reflect people in their own words and their own voices and try to take their opinions and thoughts and perspectives seriously. And I think it models the kind of relationship that we want people to have as citizens in this country. For me, at this point in my career, I have clarity about my mission. I want to have fun. for sure. And there's a lot of fun to be had, whether it's going after what you think is bad actors or bad actions, or having fun telling lovely stories that are compelling and offer charm and insight and humor. But the thing about public radio for me is that it's transportive. It takes you to another place. It allows you to practice a kind of listening that we don't see often in our society, as everybody's kind of doom scrolling and just getting little excerpts of what one another has to say or present about themselves. It immerses you. It takes you a different place, and it lets you hear people in their own framework, and I think that's important. I think also, for me, fundamentally, as we're talking about media ethics, the idea of, we used to talk about balance. We used to talk about that's being how you define fairness. I think there's a greater requirement than that, because that can be lazy and reflexive and not true to the facts. I think you need fairness to the facts. I think you need fairness to the people you're writing about or reporting on, whether they've done something wonderful or something seemingly terrible. You need to be fair to them. I think you need to be fair to your audience and the people that you're trying to serve, and make sure that they're contextualized, prepared to understand what you're talking about. And I think you need to be fair to a broader society that may or may not be listening to what you have to say. And these are things that are really important as we are asking people for trust, and are really important in a time when fewer and fewer people are bestowing it upon us in the press. But bearing witness leads to a lot of important things. People sometimes think about it in terms of the things that make movies, right? We think of All the President's Men. That was a movie about seemingly a pair of, scruffy Metro reporters on the local desk at the Washington Post upending a presidency. The real story is a little more complicated than that, but they sure as heck played a real role in it. We think about the story Spotlight. It's a tough story, but a brilliant movie about journalism, one of the most accurate I've ever seen. And what they did was essentially hold accountable in Boston the way the Catholic Church had dealt with priests who were accused of abusing children. And ultimately, it had such a repercussion that it changed the way in which the Vatican dealt with the problem globally, and inspired reporting all around the world. It was not a news story. They were not the only people ever to have done it, but the way in which they held this powerful institution to account was extraordinary. And let's remember that story, and I've spoken quite a lot with Marty Barron, the editor who set it in motion. One of the things he did was say, well, can we get names? Can we learn about facts about how these cases were adjudicated? And they said, oh no, those are all sealed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And he asked why, and he said, because the church has asked it to be sealed. And he said, well, I think we should challenge that. But that was a very difficult and very brave thing to do in such a dominantly Catholic city, Boston. One of my first friends from Idaho was Dean Miller, who had been an editor in Idaho Falls, and he did much the same thing about holding folks to account. I believe it was Boy Scouts or camps up there where there were similar questions being raised some years ago, and it was not a particularly popular move to hold that institution to account, but ultimately it revealed real terrible actions there. It held an institution to account, and it seemed to inaugurate important reforms there. These are bearing witness. If you think about Flint, Michigan, there were children drinking water saturated with lead and toxins. And it was reporting that brought it to light in a way that public officials could no longer turn their eyes away from it. And then it had repercussions for towns across the Midwest that had similar policies and similar failings. And truth had to be acknowledged there. That is bearing witness. That is not holding surveillance, right? That is bearing witness. You think in Mississippi, poverty programs set up to fund ways to lift people out of poverty, to help people through it, to make sure there's health care. Those funds were used to pay for major athletic facilities at places like Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, in part because Brett Favre, an amazing quarterback who I loved watching, I got to say, not my team, but I loved watching him on the Packers, had lobbied the governor to do so because his daughter was a volleyball player there. And so they diverted, I think, over $1 million for that. These are, the governor sued Mississippi Today, the not-for-profit that really went to town on that story, and they stood up and really defended it. There's still some elements of that being litigated. I don't know how it'll turn out. But by and large, as a story, there was a real problem there, and that was surfaced by people bearing witness. Okay. So bearing witness is important. But let's acknowledge also, let's not be precious. News organizations are flawed. And if they weren't, I probably would be employed a lot less often. My job is predicated on writing about the interaction and collision and intersection of the press and politics. And sometimes it's about, politicians behaving badly and how the press get that to light. Sometimes it's about the press behaving badly. But most of the time, it's that the press is made up of human beings under financial and professional pressures and acting imperfectly. But we saw the results of that. Journalists are not immune from public opinion. Journalists are not immune from thinking in herds, which is not always a good way to go. Journalists are not immune from just being wrong at times. So there was reporting on COVID that was mistaken, that was wrong. People were being told, that it wasn't safe to gather even outside. It turned out that wasn't the case. Let's be fair, the science was evolving. It was new. We hadn't seen a pandemic like that in 100 years in this country. That's a real hard story to get right in real time. And I have real sympathy for the public health journalists who got things wrong. They were relying often on public health officials, academics, and government officials, all of whom were trying in real time to figure it out too. But still, there was reporting that was wrong. And as a result, as we were told, we shouldn't go get masks, and it turned out that was because they were hoarding it for first-line responders. That's an understandable decision, but if the press reports that at face value, it kind of corrodes the trust people have in what they're being told. President Biden, the press insufficiently tried to drill down on whether or not he was up to the task. And they were told, well, Biden's being Biden, he's slow to step, but he's fine. And they couldn't get people to give real examples of ways in which it had affected him, but it turned out it had. And the Wall Street Journal did good reporting on this before he fell apart at that presidential debate in the summer of 2024. And a lot of journalists took shots at that reporting. And I wasn't quite so sure that the journalists at the Journal were wrong. They were very, very dedicated, scrupulous reporters, and they ultimately proved to be right on that. That sort of thing tends to corrode truths. You saw the Steele dossier at President Trump. A lot of things that were reported on that in the first Trump term didn't hold up. And the press sort of went over its skis on what it was able to track down. NPR tends to be more cautious. We're not known for breaking the huge scandalous stories at times. But there are times where our unwillingness to report on things that we haven't been able to verify ourselves serves us well. And we were very restrained on those sort of allegations that didn't hold up. And I think that was to our credit. But there are different competing balances here. We're not, getting paid by the 5-minute increments by advertisers in quite the same degree as cable news, trying to goose audiences. We're trying to build trust over time and ensure that we're doing a range of coverage that comports with people understanding, not ideologically, but in terms of our value systems, how we report the news, what kinds of things we report. And we are mortal too, and we will fall short too, and that's going to be part of the trust equation, but also has to be part of the understanding that not all of that is malevolent. People will attack the motives of journalists repeatedly. Most of them, even the ones I report on, honestly believe in what they're doing. I reported on a Rolling Stone story, a cover story, about accusations of a gang rape, of abuse of this woman at the University of Virginia. And I spoke at length with the reporter involved. It was clear to me two things. One, she had really egregiously fallen short in her reporting. And two, she did so because she believed the victim, or the alleged victim, the woman who said this happened to her, and she thought she was protecting her from additional victimizing and targeting by not pressing hard on trying to verify all of the facts that she presented. That was a terrible betrayal of journalistic trust, but I don't think she did it from a place of, I'm going to make something up. I think she did it because she confused a kind of activism with facts-based reporting. There is one of the questions came up, there were a lot of great questions from students today. I really got a lot out of our give and takes over several sessions, but one of them was about, can you infuse personal beliefs? Can you do point of view? My feeling is, first off, if you're transparent, you can do almost anything, but you have to be very upfront with the audience. Did you pay somebody for an interview? Okay, but you have to tell the audience what you paid, and you got to say why. And if you're a little skittish about doing that, if that makes you queasy, maybe that's a pretty good reality check that you shouldn't be doing it in the first place, right? Are you making up an element of a story? Have you disclosed that? Are you making up a name? Are you creating a thing? There was a piece in the Atlantic that was a very interesting piece that was sort of it explained what happened when a kid comes down with measles and it can't be treated. And in rare cases, that's the case, and people die. And, if you don't get vaccination, of course, your risk of getting measles is much greater. It turned out she was writing based on rigorous reporting what would happen were that to occur. But it was written in such a way that until the very end, there was no indication whatsoever that that was a scenario and not an actually reported piece. And so they ultimately had to have editor's note, and people attacked the Atlantic. I think the people at Atlantic operated in good faith, but if you're not transparent about what you're doing, I think that can undercut what's happening. If you're approaching it from a point of view, just acknowledge that. But, I'm not saying NPR's way is the only way. I feel like we get to broadcast the whole nation, and I feel very lucky for that. And therefore, I feel my political beliefs don't matter that much. My personal values of fairness might matter. My personal, my desire that people treat each other decently might matter, and I think they do. But there's no, an agenda doesn't get me or my colleagues out of bed in the morning because that's not what we're about. We're trying to tell stories. Let's talk a little bit about ways in which, as we think about the idea of bearing witness, as we think the idea of elevating stories about our communities or about our country or about the wars that we're involved with, we are the subject of our own personal strengths and imperfections, but increasingly we are finding that the press is subject to the pressures of others. If you think about, I've been reporting on so many, there are a variety of ways in which this pressure is brought to bear. And in the Trump era, it has just happened on a range and an intensity and a frequency I've never seen. And I've covered media now, started in 2000. I've covered media for 26 years. You're seeing people filing personal lawsuits who hold positions of power, starting with the president. It is just a different thing to be sued by somebody who's in office or has held a position like that. Usually those kinds of figures, they don't like it, but they accept certain kinds of rough and tumble as part of the price of being in politics and the opportunity to take that. The president has chosen to look at this differently. You're also seeing the Justice Department getting increasingly aggressive about how it views the leaks of information it does not want public. You've seen the Defense Department restrict information and restrict reporters' access to others at the Defense Department that it is not explicitly authorized to speak with the public. You're seeing, you saw the stripping of public broadcasting money from federal sources, and one could argue that there's a perfectly legitimate policy debate to have. Trump's argument, the president's argument in his executive order and in public, at least the messaging going along with the executive order, was that he's punishing NPR and its stations, and PBS and their stations, because basically it was defined by woke news judgment and it's terribly unfair. A federal judge found that that was unconstitutional and that it was after the fact punishment for NPR's editorial decisions on what to cover and how to cover, and similarly for PBS. And in fact, the institutions most punished by that were PBS, but really the local stations. And one of the funny ironies about that is that although the president was trying to drive a wedge between local, and lawmakers were trying to drive a wedge between local stations and NPR, and to a significant extent PBS as well, but really NPR, a lot of the stations have to rely on us more because the local reporting, having somebody grounded in the community, broadcasting stories about what's happening here, what affects your lives, is actually more expensive than paying us to run our stories. And as much as I love to be on the air, as much as possible, and I'm accused of liking the sound of my own voice by my friends who tease me for going from print to broadcast, actually I'd love local stations to have the ability to do more, because I think that's what the emotional connection is. They like hearing us and we're part of their lives and their routines, but they want to know their own communities are being represented. And so there's a bitter irony there in terms of the effects of what happened as a result of this. So what are the repercussions of this? Well, let's think of it in ways large and small. You saw in Minneapolis, there was a lot of crackdown on reporters reporting on what ICE was doing with people who were being accused of being in this country illegally. You saw Don Lemon, the former CBS anchor, and an independent reporter and former local TV news reporter named Georgia Fort, who are charged by the feds with essentially a law that was written to protect protesters from basically entering or being on the grounds of abortion clinics, but also was expanded in some ways to include religious facilities, synagogues, churches, temples, the likes. And they were accused of violating a church by being present during a protest and chronicling that. They were accused of participating in the protest by federal authorities. Now, this is the sort of thing that maybe if they were involved in some sort of civil disturbance, there would be a local charge, trespassing, disorderly, disrupting a religious service, what have you. These are federal serious charges being lodged here. The Justice Department is doing this, and the president, the Attorney General and others were very clear. Forgive me, now former Attorney General Pam Bondi, were very clear that they were doing this because of what they felt Don Lemon and Georgia Fort represented, which was a point of view hostile to what ICE was doing. That's going to have some First Amendment challenges as well in court, and we'll see how that's adjudicated. But that is, whatever you think about it, it is the use of the Justice Department to curtail reporting they don't like. That's an interesting thing in a country where the question of free speech and freedom of the press was the First Amendment made to the Constitution itself. You see over at the Washington Post, one of the most storied news organizations in the country, the paper that owned the coverage of Watergate, as I mentioned, you're seeing challenges there too. You saw the Justice Department raid the home, the FBI raid the home of a reporter, Hannah Nathanson, who had acquired information that the Justice Department said she got from a contractor for the National Security Agency that they didn't want public. And maybe they're right that information shouldn't become public, but typically the way the courts have interpreted it, it's illegal for a contractor to let that stuff be public, but the reporter itself not so. And yet the Justice Department seized all her materials. Usually what happens is they make a request of the news organization, so the news organization has a chance to challenge it in court and to narrow the scope of what is obtainable by law enforcement only to what is absolutely necessary to prove their case on somebody having illegally leaked something. The idea is the person leaking is doing something illegal. The person receiving the leak, if they're not acting on behalf of a foreign power, they're acting on the press. The press has a lot of leeway or has historically been seen to have that leeway ever since the Pentagon Papers case in the early 70s. So the Washington Post is fighting that right now. Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, obviously also the founder of Amazon, is paying every dollar for top-notch legal team to fight the Justice Department and do so. However, Jeff Bezos, who really was clear during Trump's first term in office that he would essentially pay any price for the independence of his newspaper, in the lead up to the second term, did something very different. It's pretty apparent Bezos believed that it was likely that Trump would return to office, not just possible. Ahead of the election, we broke the story that he killed, he and his publisher, but really he killed a planned editorial endorsement of Kamala Harris. That was consistent with the position that the editorial stand at Pages had taken about Trump previously. He then moved to essentially gut the way in which his opinion pages operated and change their outlook to focusing almost expressly on personal liberties and free markets, which is very similar to the position of the Wall Street Journal, although I think it's translated out a little differently. But really to pull back from being a place that was a beacon of principled opposition to the way in which the administration interpreted the right to exercise huge executive powers. And in the second term, if anything, far greater than what Trump attempted in the first administration. Whether you like his policies or not, he is seeking to do so in a way that blows away pretty much anything that was been attempted in recent generations. And why has Jeff Bezos done that? Well, he has said that this is more consistent with his belief system, and that may well be right. But you saw him, on the dais of the inauguration in January 2025 with all these other tech titans. He gave $1 million towards the inauguration costs. It's not something he did for Joe Biden, whom his paper endorsed. Like other tech titans, he decided he was going to be on board. And as a result, he has fundamentally changed the nature of his newspaper. He has cut his paper's newsroom by almost half in recent months. I mean, that is an extraordinary and devastating thing to that newspaper, including killing almost all of its foreign coverage at a time of wars. And for a market that is very interested in international affairs, the federal government, the U.S. government, what we do, sending men and women abroad to fight for us or to defend our nation's strategic interests, what we do with taxpayer dollars, it does not stop at our borders, even if it's an America First administration. But Bezos decided that was the thing to do. He may well have done that, and I actually believe it's likely he did that because after years of losses, he said, I want this to be self-sustaining financially, and I want you to find me a model that will do that. But his stock value, his personal wealth, went up in the first 5 weeks of this year by more than 3 times what it would have taken, that little additional extra $7.5 billion, to endow the Washington Post in perpetuity. This is a conscious choice. It is worth it to him not to do this. He lost out on a $10 billion contract in Trump's first term after Trump said, I don't want the Amazon Washington Post getting that money from the Defense Department. And it was splintered in a bunch of groups, and Amazon ultimately got a small slice of it. But Amazon's cloud computing services and Bezos's Blue Origin space company have contracts with the federal government worth billions. And it appears that the Washington Post, the irritation that it posed to the president, isn't worth it to him. Again, I don't think Bezos is interfering at all in any of the reporting that's happening. I believe in the integrity of the report on the news pages of the Washington Post, and I've seen no evidence to the contrary. But what they're able to do is narrowed significantly, and the principled critiques that used to appear, whether you agree with them or not, on the editorial pages have been largely wiped away. So that is somebody who bestrides the earth as one of the wealthiest people ever to walk on this planet. And from all reporting and all evidence publicly visible, he yielded to power. If you look at Nexstar, which I've just written a story that will probably run tomorrow on our website. This is the nation's largest local TV station. So local TV station groups basically own the stations that serve significant markets. So I'm sure there's some based in Boise and some based in in Pullman, certainly Spokane. I'm advised. I had to work. I apologize, but I had to work on Moscow. I had to work on that. But I did work on it. I want you to know, for a broadcast guy, it's important to get it right. But man, did that take some time. If you think about Nexstar, they already were the largest owner of TV stations around the country. They reached 39% of the country, of all the households in the country, which is just insane. It's basically 2 out of every 5 households in the country. Why do we know that they were at 39? Well, that is the legal limit that you're allowed to do. But they just, kind of like that, were able to get approval from antitrust regulators in the Department of Justice and from the Federal Communications Commission that said it posed no question of antitrust concerns to absorb another company called Tegna, which used to be Gannett, but together they now reach 80% of the country. That is twice what was allowed by law. They got a waiver. It is quite possible that's totally legal, but I don't believe it's ever been done before. And they did it without a full vote of the Federal Communications Commission, that is the presidentially appointed and Senate-approved members of a public commission. It was done by people within a division of the FCC that is sort of overseen by the chairman of it, who's a strong ally of the president. And it did so just a month after the president had said publicly he wanted this deal to go through. And within a day of it being clear that a number of state attorneys general were going to file suit to try to block this deal. So they were able to approve it, and the deal was consummated, just hours later, just before the attorneys general were able to file a lawsuit. This is being now fought out in court. We'll see what happens. Nexstar is an interesting company. They're based in Dallas. They're seen as leaning a little conservative. They created a new cable channel called News Nation out of what used to be, I think, WGN, which was a Tribune super channel on which I think the Cubs used to run. And WGN stood for World's Greatest Newspaper, which is how Colonel McCormick used to refer to the Chicago Tribune. It was a sister company of that. And News Nation sort of at the outset was like, look, everybody else is biased, like Fox and CNN and MSNBC, and like we're going to be not biased. But over time, they started making fun of CNN and some of their promotions. They've hired a number of folks from Fox. At least one of them was fired by Fox. Two of them were fired by Fox for being insufficiently pro-Trump. So, be fair on those grounds. And they've hired some folks from other places as well, ABC and MSNBC. But it is an outlet that appears to be at the moment seeking to attract some of the Newsmax or MAGA audience explicitly in a way that doesn't comport with being a straight down the line news agency. Again, take that what you will. They're absolutely entitled to do that. They have different folks and different voices, but they seem to be trying to find ways to appease President. What was one way we can offer that? Last fall, Jimmy Kimmel made some remarks about who was really being blamed or assigned blame in the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And he said, Trump and MAGA folks are trying very hard to pretend that it's not one of theirs. I'm not sure that that's a remotely fair thing to say, in the sense that, the motivations seem cloudy, but it does not seem that the accused killer, belongs to have that designation of being a Trump supporter. But Brendan Carr, the head of the Federal Communications Commission, said Jimmy Kimmel should be pushed off ABC. His late night show should be gone, and we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way, meaning Disney can pull him or I can get involved. That is very strong public statement for the guy who's the chief regulator, the chief federal official charged with overseeing the broadcast outlets. Within a few hours, Nexstar stepped up. It's, $6.2 billion transaction being considered by this very same official. It stepped and said, we agree, we're going to pull Jimmy Kimmel from our stations. And Sinclair Broadcast, the second largest TV station group, which also wants to acquire other stations and has other things pending in front of these same agencies, said, we're going to do it as well. And Sinclair is far more explicitly conservative and pro-Trump than Nexstar or its News Nation station. But nonetheless, both these big television station groups that own hundreds of stations said, we're going to kick Jimmy Kimmel off. And then Disney essentially had no choice. It pulled Kimmel. But the backlash was fascinating. People started canceling Hulu. Some people started canceling ESPN, I'm told, or in the bundles. And Disney, within a week, says, no, we're going to have this. And the interesting thing is there's counterbalances. You can have the large station groups saying, we're going to take your guy off. And Disney's like, God, it'd be a real shame if you weren't able to get, professional football games, which is the number one thing people want to watch on old-fashioned TV. And so they put it back on. But that was an example of Nexstar stepping up and sort of echoing the call. And these things have repercussions. If you think about CBS, CBS was up last year for sale. A group called Skydance, controlled by the Ellison family, wanted to buy it. The former owners, Sherry Redstone, wanted to sell it. She didn't see any path to making this a successful company. Paramount, which is the owner of CBS, was too small. It was too small a studio, it's too small of a TV station. They just didn't have it, their streamer. Like, I'm sure very few of you have Paramount as a streamer compared to Hulu or Netflix, or, it just didn't quite have the size and the velocity. So she didn't do it herself exactly, but they announced Stephen Colbert was being forced off the air. He is not a journalist, but he is kind of an acidic commentator on President Trump, and he is the guy that Trump finds most objectionable. Late night. So suddenly that is gone. And it was part of a series of concessions made mostly by the Ellison family to buy it, but some by Sherry Redstone to sell it, that pleased Brendan Carr, and that the FCC commissioner said so. So people make requests or demands of companies all the time in transactions. You have to sell a few stations here. We'd like you to be more thoughtful about this there. You've had some issues with, you've had some issues on hiring practices in the past. We'd like there to be, 2 years during which you're going to tell us your progress on certain things. This is much more aggressive. This is about specific programming. This is about likes and dislikes. And to a certain extent, they got what they want. The Ellisons got other things too. Larry Ellison is the guy guaranteeing all this money. David Ellison is his son. Wanted to be an actor, didn't work out. Wanted to go into production, had some money from his father. Made some pretty good movies. He made basically the Mission Impossible franchise. That was cool. Made the Top Gun remake. It's a good movie. I liked it a lot. I certainly paid money to go see that in the cinemas. And so, he made some things that were clunkers, but made some things that really worked. But he wanted to take over something bigger. He wanted to take over Paramount and CBS. Larry Ellison is funding it. Larry Ellison is the co-founder of Oracle, which is the software company on which it's sort of the backbone for most business and government functionings and software. So it's hugely important to the nation's infrastructure. And he was cut in with some Trump's pressure to be sort of the controlling American owner of TikTok US. And now they are poised, they're trying to get approval to take over Warner Brothers Discovery, which is going to happen, it seems. And that includes CNN. So you've got Ellison, who in a short amount of time is going to have control of software infrastructure, CBS, and CNN, and TikTok, social media, digital infrastructure, older-fashioned media. This is an extraordinary array of information that the Ellisons will have ultimate ownership or control over in terms of how we think about these things. I don't mean to say it's necessarily sinister, but it is an extraordinary consolidation of information in like a year and a half's time. The Murdochs took decades to roll things up, to create things, to buy things. They now own the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and, the New York Post and other things. This is an extraordinary array of collections at times. Why does this matter? Well, this matters because Larry Ellison is of the belief that all information should be centrally controlled and available, and that we should live essentially in a life that is surveilled, that the federal government should be able to have access to closed-circuit CV cameras around the country. And you can like that or not like that. I think the little Ring camera I have is useful. And yet, if we're all under surveillance 100% of the time, what does that mean about our freedom and our sense of privacy, our sense of self, our sense of who we are? Larry Ellison says, if we have maximal surveillance that is available to government authorities, this is, quote, all citizens will be on their best behavior. And this is a guy who's interested in your information, how you operate digitally and online, what information he can glean from that, and where he can take from other places. It's a different idea of bearing witness than the one that I hold from a journalistic standpoint. And so it is one that I think informs the level of scrutiny that CBS is getting as it's under new leadership. CBS News being led by a woman who created the center-right website, The Free Press. Some people are very skeptical of her changes. A number of very accomplished journalists have left. Anderson Cooper pulled out of 60 Minutes, even though she was offering him a bigger role there because he's concerned about where she was leading the network. That said, not everything is that different from the way it would have been in the past. And so I think it's worth watching what people do. But nonetheless, we are in a time where it seems as though news organizations and their owners in particular are subject to an extraordinary amount of pressure. And one thing I've learned over the 26 years I've covered the media is that the choices that people make affect what we see and what we hear and what we read in the press. And the question is, will that pressure lead to changes in the information available to us at a time that government information is being taken offline and a lot of research and independent sources of information are losing their funding? And the question that leaves me with comes from Big Brother again, but not the CBS show, the original, in 1984. George Orwell wrote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." So what I would encourage is people use their own eyes and ears, think for themselves, rely on varied sources, believe in journalists and journalistic outlets that time again prove themselves to be operating in good faith, imperfect though they may be, and to hold their public figures and also their news outlets to account themselves. Thank you for this. Thank you for squandering a perfectly good evening. I hope you'll ask some questions because I'm here to answer them. Thanks so much.
Earlier today, you mentioned that you can't separate news, politics, and entertainment. And that reminded me of last year's Oppenheimer keynote speaker, Christine Brennan from USA Today. She asserted that sports are inherently political. But sports and entertainment, these aspects of the media industry often get dismissed or not treated as seriously. So why should we care about what is happening in entertainment media organizations or within sports media organizations?
Sure. Well, I really liked the first season of Ted Lasso. And, one of the stars of that would say, soccer is life. Sports is life, right? Sports are a way in which we figure out what it is to be human. I like the fact that my 3 girls all play soccer because they're playing with, some of them are their friends, and some of them, as I like to say, are friends they haven't made yet. But they're learning to connect with other people and to do things in a collaborative endeavor. My best friend, in many ways, is Jeremy Schaap, an ESPN anchor. His godfather, I want to point out, is Jerry Kramer, a proud graduate of Idaho, University of Idaho, a great figure. And Jeremy was named for Jerry Kramer. Jeremy loves sports. His father was an incredibly distinguished sports journalist, and he breathed it. Like, he remembers Joe Namath in his home trying to blow cigarette in the nostrils of his dogs. So he just came up, thinking about sports. But he doesn't simply tell stories about what happens on the field. He tells story about the culture of it, the nature of it, the personalities behind it, and the things that course through the American experience also flow through the athletic experience, whether they're kids playing for a high school team or, the most famous professional athletes that or the owners of those teams. So sports journalism is journalism. It happens to be about sport. And by the way, let's not forget sports are big business, and sports are a huge part of popular culture. So, these are incredibly important institutions. They also, major professional teams these days in stadiums take a ton of tax dollars. Like, we should be reporting about all kinds of stuff. And for decades, most of the time, people only paid attention to what happened on the field. And they sort of ignored or forgave or intentionally forgot anything that happened off the field, except, a manager's tirade about the game or the umpires or whatever. There can be overdoing it. I think athletes deserve the right to be imperfect as well and to kind of figure themselves out. Oftentimes when they're stars, they're often still very young. Like an old grizzled hand would be somebody 20 years younger than me. So, sometimes they're overcovered and just every post on Instagram or something is given too much scrutiny. But I think sports reporting is real reporting right down to the thing. I think it involves money and influence and culture and, kind of how we think about ourselves, how we style ourselves, who we want to be as a culture. They're great, they're unifying. Also, in terms of sports journalism, complicating. ESPN, which does great independent journalism, also has a business deal with the NFL right now. How are they going to cover that? I mean, they're essentially all in business. NBC is essentially a full partner in the Olympics. So these are complicated things, but we have to manage them and be transparent about them at minimum, rather than sort of pretend it doesn't exist, not cover it. Let me give one plug for my employer. And this is not about sports exactly, but we cover ourselves. I cover ourselves, but we cover ourselves. And I have contractual rights to do it. And for years, they have given me full freedom to work with a small number of editors under a protocol to cover stuff involving NPR. And no time was that more intense than last year when leaders of Congress, Republican leaders of Congress, were assailing us and senators were denouncing us on the floor, and yet we have to cover it state and bring that news to people too. We've got to quote them, and that's fine. That's okay. It's right to do. And the thing that it reminds me is that NPR allows us to live our journalistic values even in moments of crisis or when things seem toughest. And they let us do things that are independent. And sometimes my bosses don't love it. And believe me, I hear it. Just as I hear it when, somebody at the Washington Post or Fox News doesn't like it. But that's okay, because that's the job we're assigned to do. We can live our values doing that. So, I think that's true for sports. I think that's true for anything. And I learned how to reading the sports pages. That's how I learned how to read. My mom was like, oh, thank God, David's not going to ask about sports, and he'll do fine reading at some point. And I just looked up, looking over my dad's shoulder and say, Dad, what's a relief pitcher? And she said, oh, I'm hosed. He's going to be interested in sports after all.
All right, so this question has popped up in many different forms. But as students still learning, How do you suggest young minds find the least biased sources that give us information correct and fast?
It's a process, not a formula, right? You're not going to say, all right, if I just punch this into my smartphone, I'm automatically going to get, perfect news reporting, except from Dave, of course. But in reality, what I encourage you to do is look at a broad variety of sources. Look at the original sites, look at their official accounts, look at journalists that you've found before who have told stories that have held up and don't just disappear, that other reporters maybe follow and confirm after the fact, because that tells you that it's worked. News outlets that tell you things time after time that ring true and that are based on verified sources that maybe they link to or that they can go to, or people are spoken by name most of the time or identified by name. Anything that gives greater veracity for that, give a little bit more trust to. Create your own little algorithm, but it's not an algorithm. It's just hey, you know what? The Wall Street Journal's news reports are really good. They're very intense. They seem to be incredibly scrupulously fair. I can trust it time after time because time after time their stories turn out to be true. The Associated Press, by and large, they work really hard to try to get it right. They're not perfect, but they really work hard. There may be papers that you value or news outlets or stations that you value that say, you know what? I know how they did their reporting, particularly if you know something about a story and it kind of rings true. Anytime it's closer to you, you'll see the little things they get wrong magnified, but give them a little grace because they're not living it the way you're living it. But nonetheless, people who show fairness, people who didn't treat the Idaho campus murders as though it was just salacious and a great story, but as a human tragedy. Maybe that's something you give a little more faith to. So I would intentionally look at things from across the ideological spectrum. Read things that are conservative or liberal or libertarian or anti-war or pro-Trump or whatever. But hold them equally accountable. Are they fair? Are they fair to the facts? Are they fair to the people they're covering? Are they fair to an opposing point of view? Are they fair to the audience that's reading it? Are they fair to the greater society? Are they just trying to cause trouble and stir up things? Or are they actually interested in figuring out what works, what doesn't, and maybe how things could be better? Those are all questions to hold in your head and come back to them. People who are influencers online are often how people, particularly the students I talk to, are encountering news for the first time. They may not have links to the original stories, but the ones that say, hey, I got this from Bloomberg News, I got this from the Miami Herald, and they put a headline up in a story, and maybe they put the links in the comments section of their account. They're at least trying to get you the information you need to sort of read into it. And every now and then, click on the link to a full video of a state senator's remarks that were controversial and see the full context of it. Don't just watch the 12-second clip. Go to the fuller thing and say, all right, let me look at the minute and a half before it and the minute and a half after. Does this seem like a fair representation of what actually happened? And if so, maybe I can trust this reporter or this influencer or this news site. But, I'm a guy who likes to read the footnotes of books. So, the one book that I wrote, I tried to put some jokes in the footnotes too, just so people would keep reading. But I like to see where the actual stuff comes from. And I do sometimes click the links. I want to see what the original things are. Don't do that all the time. You'd lose your entire life. Every now and then, click it. See what the credibility is. I can't remember what the Mark Bittman line is about what to eat or what not to eat. But basically, graze widely. Don't overindulge on anything.
What steps need to be taken to protect journalism from political pressure or censure? And what can we as media consumers do when we see events unfolding that look like political pressure or look like external forces impacting the ability of an organization to report on stories?
This is a really tough question. For example, the Washington Post, people would say, well, should I just cancel my subscription? And we broke the news that 300,000 people canceled their subscription after Bezos killed the editorial. I'm sure a lot of them were liberals who were longtime subscribers or maybe recent subscribers who felt the betrayal. But I think a lot of people also just felt, from the people that talked to me, there was a section of those people who just felt, whatever you think about the decision, it's under pressure for the wrong reasons. For example, Jeff Bezos had every right to never do an endorsement. When he bought the paper in 2013, he could say, I'm not going to endorse. When a new publisher came in, at the beginning of 2024, so the presidential year. He started in January 2020. That would have been an amazing time to say, we're not going to do presidential endorsements anymore. Totally is right. You do it, 12 days before the election or something? You do it when the endorsement's not only decided, but already written? Like, that's a different facet. People interpret that, I think rightly, that it's happening for different reasons. And so, people said, should we do that? Another 75,000 canceled, we broke this, when they changed the editorial section. And they essentially, the editorial editor resigned. I mean, I think amicably enough, but heartbroken over what had happened. And their Pulitzer Prize winning editorial cartoonist resigned, and I think another about 10,000 resigned roughly that time, but it's a little harder to peg to that person. Like, that's how people responded. I'm not advising that. That means there are fewer resources for the newsroom, which are still good people of good intentions are laboring hard to make good reporting. So I find that's a conundrum. There was, in 1976, 73, there was a famous National Lampoon, which was a satirical magazine at the time, and it said, buy this magazine or I'll shoot this dog. And there was a gun going at a cute little pooch like that. And so it feels a little bit like that, but I think you have to kind of check your own conscience and your own soul. What do you want to support? What do you want to spend your time in? One thing I like about NPR is we're free for everyone in perpetuity. That's the deal. It's not very complicated. But I very much respect the fact and the need for news organizations to charge money. That is a pressure point. You can pressure advertisers. You can cancel streaming. People can do things. I don't know what the right answer is. I think you've got to examine what you want. If a news report is distorted, I think that's a point maybe one backs away. And that can come from a variety of directions. And you can decide to come back in a while and give them a choice. I will say, if you write a letter to top editors saying why you're doing it, they read those things. And you can also do it even without canceling. And they read those things because they're all primed on analytics and they all want your subscriptions to stick around. They all want you to watch. They all want you to read. But these are hard choices.
How do you come up with the stories that you want to cover? How frequently do stories get initiated by someone reaching out to you versus some idea that you come up with on your own or a trend that you see?
So, great question. There was this advertising campaign on NPR's website that says something like who, how, why, and sort of our letters are flipping and rolling that. And then if you look at the copy that they took out in some ads, it says something along the lines of, reporters don't come up with ideas for stories, the people do, and, we listen to you. And it's great. In many ways, that's true. But no, we're not just sort of sitting and waiting for people to call us. We're trying to figure out what the stories are. And yes, if a lawsuit is, I've basically spent the last 15 months as a court reporter who happens to be focusing on the media because there's been so much litigation and so many executive orders and so many lawsuits and so many challenges to transactions and whatever that I've learned. I feel like, I could get a degree in this institution within a couple hours, just by virtue of that. But, when a lawsuit happens, I'll just go to a boss and say, I think this is not worth covering or I think it is. Most of the time, though, it's not like that. Most of the time, you're saying, look, I could cover the ocean. The New York Times has about 9 people who cover what I do, and NPR has about me people to do what I do, right? And so the plus side is we get to choose, because we can't do everything. You cannot be everywhere. And the Wall Street Journal approaches non-financial news this way, where they say, we don't cover everything, we're just going to cover what we do really well. And so that is our aspiration. I like to stay ahead of editors so that I don't get assigned kind of dopey stories. So I like to have 6 to 9 sort of stories, about 4 or 5 of which I'm actually working on at any given time, and then have others that are, just right in the hot plate behind me that I can pick up and do. But sometimes events happen that you don't know about, and they feed them to you, and they say, or because I'm no longer a newspaper reporter, it's been 20. Carry the one. I joined NPR in 2004, so I'm about 21 plus years. And, as a newspaper reporter, you knew what section your stories would appear in unless it somehow floated to the front page or a different section. But you lived in a home. I wrote for the features section the last time. I wrote for the front news section when I was covering Congress, that sort of thing. For me, I write for the website all the time. I appear in podcasts, but also there are all these shows. So sometimes the shows say, hey, we'd really love you to come on and talk about this dynamic. So I'll say, great. Or we'd like you to profile so-and-so. Dan Bongino left the Justice Department, the FBI, to go do his podcast again. A senior show producer said, hey, would you like to take a look at him? So I'm hoping to get the time to go do that. I think that's a really interesting question. What is this podcast like now that he's been in government? Is he still peddling the same conspiracy theories now that he saw what everything said in all those files? Maybe he's approaching it a little differently. He just interviewed the president a bit ago. I'd be interested in seeing what the man has to say. So, you're surrounded by smart people. You want them to make you look smarter than you actually are. You take their ideas. But most of the time, I'm constantly talking to people who play a variety of roles within the profession or around it. And so in talking with them, it's not that they're saying you should do X. It's that somebody says something and it inspires you to go do it.
As students, we hear a lot about objectivity, trustworthiness, and credibility. Do you think that news outlets that are biased toward certain viewpoints or certain political parties can also be trustworthy?
Yeah, I do. But I think they need to be transparent about who they are. And I think they need to be interested in countervailing facts and arguments. So by and large, for example, I think Mother Jones does a very good job of this. It's definitely on the left. There's no doubt about that. Came from sort of a crusading opinion. They seem to me to be, by and large, very fact-based and interested in that. And, it's magazine journalism, it's ideological journalism, but by and large, less about sort of contention and hyperbole and more about, hey, this fulfills our interests and therefore we're going to go after it. Washington Free Beacon did a pretty good job of that from the right, I felt, where I think that their reporters, by and large, tried to be based on facts, even as it has clearly a conservative outlook. And they're interested in presenting stories that would appeal to their audience, but also taps into kind of where they're coming from. They feel that, there's the problem in some ways is there's this great fight over what the news outlets that don't consider themselves to be ideological, whether they are. And a lot of people think they are. Certainly Trump administration has argued that, but generations of conservatives and Republicans have argued that. And there are some ways in which there's some truth to that. I think that, newsrooms, people who worked in American newsrooms tended to be more likely to support gay rights early or to be interested in environmental causes than necessarily the public at large to a certain degree. On the other hand, there are a lot of journalists at big news organizations that are kind of inherently against taxes and tend to buy into certain conservative ways of thinking about budgeting, in part because the folks at the big networks, CBS and CNN, whatever, were making a lot of money and we're thinking a lot like people who are high-powered lawyers or whatever who are making that kind of money. Most journalists don't make that kind of money, but it affects kind of how they think. So I think ideologies are a little blurrier than people often make out. Objectivity was, for many decades, considered kind of the high peak of what ethical journalism was seen as being. And I think that's really been replaced by an idea of fairness. And the idea of fairness is being scrupulous about the facts, I think it's, when I started out, people would say, well, you can't have a point of view when you start a story. I don't think you should have an ideological point of view when you start out a story, but you may have an idea of where that story is headed. Otherwise, you wouldn't go out on the assignment at all. What would interest you about it? I think you have to be open to the fact that you're wrong. Life is more complicated, more interesting than what you think sitting home in your living room. You go out, you talk to people, and that complicates your story. And that makes a better story. It makes for a richer life. It makes for wilder anecdotes. And then you got to kind of, accommodate all this stuff. I think if you're going to make a case that somebody has acted wrongly or some institution has done something that's a problem, you have to give them the chance and the time to make the strongest case possible that what they did was the right thing to do. And you have to be open to the chance that sometimes they might convince you they're right. So to me, fairness, as I said earlier, fairness to the facts, fairness to the people you're writing about, fairness to the people you're writing for, and fairness to sort of what society needs. Not compromising your journalism, but just saying, is this the best way I can do this? I think that's superseded that. And I think you'd find in news leaders around most news organizations would acknowledge that. But objectivity was preached for a very long time, the idea that you have no point of view. I think you do have a point of view. I believe in something, and I've talked about this in our newsroom, called earned conclusions. That is, you can arrive at something of whether or not something's working or not working, but only if you've done the reporting and the homework to get you there, and only if you're willing to show your work. and you're willing to be transparent about how you got there. And I think that's a better model. You can do that if you've done your homework, and if not, then you have to be as fair as possible, and you may not reach that conclusion.
Any advice for the aspiring journalists in the room on how to be fair?
I mean, one way to do it is imagine it's a cousin of yours. And we're presuming that there's something wrong here. But, imagine or talk to somebody. One of the neat things about NPR is my stories are heard by several million people. Kind of astounding. But you're imagining talking to one person. It's very intimate. I'm just thinking I'm talking to you. I might be talking to you there. And just saying, I want to reach her. I want her to get what I'm saying. So I'm going to choose language that works, an approach that works, a tone that makes sense, and I'm going to let other people talk, right? Listening, like really listening, not just to the yes and no question that you might need answered, but to an open question that might lead you down a different path. Like, that's huge. Empathy is, to me, the paramount human value. Absolutely for journalism as well as in life. It's the thing I want most for my kids to have. For people who may look, sound different than you, people may think differently than you do. And that's really important to a reporter. Be present. Listen to what they have to say. Absorb their humanity and why they're coming to what they're coming to. Don't look down. Look toward. There are moments where it's not easy, particularly if people are being hostile to you. But you got to kind of say, well, look, this is a really unnatural thing. I've got questions for you. You owe the world an answer to it. You got to tell me what you think about this. Well, they don't have to do anything. I'm not an FBI agent. I don't have the power to subpoena somebody. I can't arrest anybody. I'm asking. So I'd say do that. Get to know the humanity. I've done I've covered Fox News for a long time. And, they are incredibly successful, a financial powerhouse and juggernaut. They are hugely important in Republican politics and as a result in American politics. And they've done a lot of crazy stuff that no other news organization would be able to get away with as a result of those things. But I know folks at Fox and have known them for decades. With the birth of a child, I'll call and, congratulate. I get nice notes every now and then for something I've done. I've found positive stories to tell about Fox. They don't always allow me access to tell them, but I've found ways to do that because there are times where it's interesting and newsworthy, not because I'm trying to make nice to them, but I think it's worth doing the story. And I've done things that are very admiring about the New York Times, but I've also done really tough coverage of them and been chewed out by them for it. But, over time, they'll acknowledge it was fair and it was the right story to tell. It's just, you got to be willing to absorb what they're saying and come back for it. And one thing I will say is don't sucker punch anybody. You're going to do a tough story on somebody, let them know you're going to do a tough story. Lay out your questions in advance. Talk to them. And one thing I would say to students also about fairness, and we talked about this in the car ride, right? There are a lot of younger journalists whom I've spoken to. I will not necessarily say students, but younger journalists I've spoken to prefer, let's say for argument's sake, a text to an email. It might be a DM to a text to an email, an email to a call, and a call to sitting down with somebody in person. Let me just say that is the inversion of the hierarchy I would offer. Sometimes you need to get the text to get the other stuff. And if you joke with somebody on text or exchange pleasantries or just communicate or whatever, it can get you there. But building trust with somebody takes time. You don't have to rush it. Sometimes some of my better stories took me 6, 10, 18 months to land the interview on the record. I'm doing one that I started on a year and a half ago. I'm hoping to land that puppy sometime this spring. But they can be some of the most emotionally powerful ones you can do because you've taken the time to do it. And you're doing that while there's some stories you have 2 hours to turn. It's not like you are only doing that. I would say it's less hard than it seems to be fair. Just be a person. And be a person. One of the great ways of doing it is do local journalism. When I worked in Charleston, South Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, even Baltimore, I got a middle initial wrong about the woman who designed Camden Yards, and I heard about it from 10 people. I had also gotten another woman's name wrong in that same story, and the editor-in-chief called me and asked if he should relieve me of my duties. Was he asking too much of me? Had I been burdened too much with the expectation I should actually do the story correctly? And so I said, really, I think that's your call, boss, but I'm really sorry about this, and we worked through it. But, he scared the pants off me at the age of 24, and I've never forgotten it. And by the way, I want to say that Janet Marie Smith, the famous architect, stadium architect who designed Camden Yards and went on to inspire a whole bunch of other new stadiums around the country, 3 years ago direct messaged me on Twitter about a story I did. And so I thanked her for this very kind note, and then acknowledged that I was the guy the schmuck who had done this, 3 decades ago. And we had a wonderful exchange about it. It was great. But if you show up, it's okay. But you're held accountable if you do local reporting, and it teaches you a degree of fairness that, if you're in Baltimore and you write that something is Blair Road because you haven't lived there and you don't understand that that's how people pronounce Bel Air Road is Blair Road, they're going to say this guy doesn't understand my community. If I came in here and was an anchor for TV that served this market, and I talked about Moscow, you guys would be like, yeah, I don't think so. So, it matters. Those are ways in which you can connect like that, too.
We've got time for one more question, so I'm going to end with a classic. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Which is, is this a job worth getting? Who would want to go into reporting? All these job cuts, the Washington Post, these other places, all these scandals, these high-powered anchors throw hissy fits. They're on page 6 of the New York Post, and, they're all in Substack mouthing off and what the hell? Why should I do this? And let me say this. You got to want it. You got to want it. This is not a job that typically you get rich in, right? But as H.L. Mencken said, it is the life of kings. It is such I feel so blessed to have the opportunity to talk to people and learn about them and to be curious. Always be curious. Ask more rather than less. Find out about them. People turn out to be fascinating creatures a lot of the time. And it's been a very enriching thing to do. I never thought I would do radio ever. And it's been a joy and a delight as well. NPR allows us to embody our values. We are imperfect, but we do a lot of terrific stuff. But I feel as though I'm allowed to be who I want to be on NPR as somebody who's trying hard to offer stuff that is fair and funny and of interest. And the other thing I'll say is, I hosted a show for several years for NPR, in addition to doing what I'm doing, and COVID cut that short. But, I always thought we could approach things with a sense of history, a sense of humility, and a sense of humor. And I think it's a pretty good way to go. Thank you, guys.